Hi guys, welcome to No Cry DIY. I'm going to show you how I built this. Well, it's finally done, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't glad it was done. I am ready to hand this thing over because it has been a couple of months of hard work. I have 2 young babies, so getting time to do a project like this took a while. This is not my job. This is just a pure hobby for me, but I am so pumped to be able to hand this over as a gift to my father-in-law. There's really 3 components to this project. The first being the flag itself, which there'll be a video on how to make the flag. Everything from how to carve it to how to put the letters on to how to dye it, carving the stars, making the frame, and making the 45-degree shelf on it, which could hold a display case. The second video will be of the walnut display case box itself. As you can see, the box is actually removable from the shelf, and you can move it around, you can open it, there are hinges, there are these beautiful brass splines all around the box. You could put anything in here. This is a legitimate walnut display case. And the third video will be of the Colt Single Action Army model inside the case. My videos are going to be a bit long, probably around 20 minutes each, but that's because I'm going to dive into the details on every step how to build something like this. The intent for me is to show other people how they can do it too. There'll be links to everything in the description. If you have any questions, you can of course leave a comment down below. I will make it my priority to respond to every comment that I get. There will also be links to every tool that I used in the description, as well as some of the videos that I really relied on to make this flag. I hope you guys like the content. I hope you'll like and subscribe so that I can continue to make these videos. Thank you.
So, the first step in this process is to cut the lumber down. I use my miter saw for this, cutting each piece at 36 inches. And the good thing about this design is the American flag at 36 inches wide has stripes that are 1.5 inches thick, so you don't have to mill your lumber at all, which is pretty nice. Over on the assembly table, I laid out all my pieces and took a look at the grain of each board. It's important that you buy all the 2x4s at the same time, that way the grain looks roughly the same. Trust me, I know, and you'll see why later. Creating the waves is a lot easier to do if you have a pattern. I've got one linked in the description below. Essentially what you're going to do is lay the pattern down, trace it onto a board, and then on each subsequent board you're going to move that pattern down about 1 inch and then trace the wave. Go ahead and trace your first pattern onto your first board and cut it out with whatever tools you have. I'm using a jigsaw here, but I also have a bandsaw. I decided to use both just in case someone out there doesn't have a bandsaw. It's a lot easier on a bandsaw, but still totally doable with a jigsaw. Because this was my pattern board, I wanted to make sure that it was nice and smooth, so I took it over to the oscillating sander and cleaned it up a little bit. Not totally necessary, but it does help when you're tracing things. Now I'm using my pattern to trace that waveform onto each of my other boards. Make sure you label as you're doing this. You really don't want to mix these up, but as you see, I'm offsetting it each time by about 1 inch following the pattern. I like this method because it really cuts down on the amount of carving you have to do later. And you can use all that extra time that you have filming lots of different camera angles of yourself, cutting out patterns on the bandsaw, and then taking that footage and creating epic black and white carving scenes for YouTube. Yeah, I wasn't kidding. Seriously, it took me more time to edit this one snippet of a scene than it did to cut out all those boards. Which means I have to leave it in. Sorry, guys. I mean, this is just Oscar-worthy content, and such beautiful technique with the angle grinder. Okay, enough of that. Seriously, what I'm doing here is I'm using my angle grinder with an arbor cutting bit on it and just knocking down all those sharp edges that we cut out from the pattern. It goes really quick. Honestly, this is probably the easiest way to make waves for one of these flags. I started sanding with my orbital sander, but this took a long time. You should definitely use the 60 grit paddle wheel for your angle grinder. Then make sure you clean all the sawdust off because...
Time to play with fire.
Now, I like blowtorches as much as the next guy, but in all honesty, guys, be safe out here. I did set up a fire extinguisher right next to this project. I once almost burned down my house. Don't remind my wife. It was a very scary event, so, take the fire safety seriously. We're really only singeing the boards here. We want to make the grain pop. That way when we go to dye it and stain it later, it'll look really cool and really rustic. Again, pay attention to the grains on your boards. You can see here that I have some really wonky grains in the middle. I replaced those off camera. I cut the Union Jack decal with my Cricut machine and used that to trace it onto the wood. I'll link that pattern in the description. Now it's time to use the dreaded Kita dye. I've never used this before. Mostly all my experiences with paints and stains, but this stuff is pretty neat. And by neat, I really mean that it looks cool when it's done, and it's easy to use, and it's not as messy as all the other stuff, but it definitely has some limitations that you'll see throughout the video. You can mix this stuff in regular water. It's very easy to work with. You just mix it up, wait a couple seconds, and apply it with a foam brush. I use the straight red directly out of the package, and they say just add more layers to get a deeper red, which is what I did. I think I did about 4 coats. And for the white stripes, I went with the Varathane Whitewash Wood Stain. This is traditional stain that you just wipe on with a foam brush, let it sit for a couple of seconds, and then wipe it off. This stuff did kind of scare me when I put it on. I thought initially that it was going to be almost like white paint, as you can see, but when it wipes off, it does actually show that burned grain through. Okay, my first qualm with Kita dye is that it bleeds quite easily along the wood grain. So you can see here I got some bleeding into the Union Jack area. I tried to clean it up with some acetone. That did not work. I tried some mineral spirits. That did not work. I ended up having to get some elbow grease out, just get some rough sandpaper and sand that down. It took quite a bit of touch up to fix some of this bleed throughout the project. Good thing is you can sand and reburn if you need to. It's not too hard. And if you get some of this metal tape here, that will help you block some of your colored areas and reburn more precisely. The whitewash stain didn't bleed quite as bad, but I was a little worried about the blue from the Union Jack bleeding into it, so I thought I'd break the pores of the wood with a utility knife. This didn't work too well, but we'll see more on that later. You know, bleeding issues or not, when you lay this thing out, I am loving the way that these colors look together. If you're intrigued by the way this looks, do me a solid. Leave a like on the video. This is my first one, and by doing so, you'll help me settle a bet with my wife, who, by the way, is an absolute saint. She was 9 months pregnant when I started this project. The glue up is a fairly straightforward process. Just have a couple of bar clamps. Make sure to use lots of tight bond on this. I like to use a foam brush, make sure that I have all the glue covered all over the wood, and clamp it down, resulting in problem number 2, I think, with the Kita dye, 2 or 3, something like that. Anyway, the glue is stained red. Maybe I didn't wait long enough for it to dry. It had been a couple of days. I don't know. But use a rubber mallet to make sure that you get all the waves kind of level with each other. You don't want to sand down your dye job later. But still use plenty of clamps. You need this thing to be tight and not come apart later. Just be ready to wipe the dye consistently so you don't stain the white stripes. But despite the known problems, it just looks so cool. So I kept using the dye for the Union Jack, mixing a little bit of blue, a little bit of black to get a darker blue than their standard blue. Again, cup of water, mixing in until you like the hue, and using judgment on the number of coats that you do. Key to die, problem numero tres. Lots of bleed out from the Union Jack into all the other stripes. So we're back to the sanding block and doing more touch-ups. Tell them all about it, Cam, from the past. Alright guys, so clearly when you use the wood dye technique, there's an issue with bleeding through, going through the actual wood grain itself. So I think what I'm going to try to do is plug in the old soldering iron and try to burn the outline of the Union Jack in a more controlled way than obviously using a blowtorch. This soldering iron here is something that I have some experience with. The wife and I have made some decorative signs in the past. You can get one of these for like 20 bucks. It's hot, it's going now, so we're gonna see if we can fix this or if we end up screwing it up even more. Ding ding ding, this technique actually does really help, so I totally recommend it. And it looks cool. Just get the soldering iron hot and put it on the wood. It's not a whole lot more to it than that. And you can see on this coat of the key to die, I get no bleed out through to the other side. So that was a winning technique. Now on to some touch-ups, and you can finish up the glue up, which will give you time to mentally prepare for the next step, which is a bit of a doozy. Instead of using a stencil, I, the genius that I am, ended up buying a decal. Originally I was actually going to put the decal down and paint the Union on this flag with a blue paint. But now that I'm doing it and I'm seeing how it's coming out and I really like it, I thought why not go the extra mile and try to get some experience carving the actual stars. I have this beautiful thing that I spent all these hours putting together. Why not do something where I can catastrophically screw it up and have to start all over again? It's really important to make sure the stars get positioned correctly, so use vinyl transfer tape, and I'll leave a link to a flag calculator in the description below, which is a really useful tool. Before engraving these things, I actually went around and traced every star decal with a standard ink pen, which really helped break the grain and make sure that I didn't get any chip out with the Dremel later. Just make sure to use a sharp pen. I wanted to break these things up even more, so I went around with a chisel and just broke the grain a little bit more. That way I knew that I wasn't getting any chip out. That little bit of prep time took a little bit of extra effort, but to be honest, it really helped with the carving. As you can see in the videos here, there's almost no chip out at the edge of those stars because it's already been broken up by the pen and the chisel. Engraving these stars with the Dremel was definitely an extra effort than just, say, painting them, but I'm really happy with the way they came out. It shows a little bit of extra care. This is a gift for my father-in-law, so I wanted to be really special and show the amount of work that went into it. I used 2 different engraving bits and 1 polishing bit, all of which is linked in the description below. I then charred the stars a little bit to match the stripes using a mini butane torch, and went around onto those stars afterwards with that Varathane whitewash stain using a small paintbrush. Just take your time, be careful, you don't really want to splash any of this stain on the Union Jack. Afterwards I went back through and brightened up the white stripes a little bit more. Now of course my design is not just a flag, it's actually part of a larger shelf, so it needs a frame. I used some oak flooring cutoffs that I bought from some guy on Facebook Marketplace. You can use any old wood, just make sure that it's wide enough to cover the flag on all 4 sides. I planed my frame down to 1 inch in thickness and of course forgot to hook up the dust collection, sending wood chips and debris all over my newly painted flag. I do stupid stuff like this all the time. Seriously, leave a comment down below if you do too. Make me feel better about myself. Case in point number 2, I did not pay attention to the edges of my boards when I did my glue up, so I had to square this thing up before putting the frame on. I thought it'd be good to add this footage in for those of you that don't have a table saw. It's really easy to make accurate straight cuts if you just use a circular saw and a straight edge. Just make sure you know the distance between the blade and the outer edge of the guide, and clamp down a straight edge and let her rip, and that thing is square and looking mighty handsome. In a very DIY fashion, I cut my miters on a miter saw and not a table saw, so sue me, but I am a big fan of using a square and actually marking down a 45-degree angle, matching your saw to that angle on the wood. You'll get much tighter miters if you do it that way. After cutting the miters and dry fitting it, I wiped everything down with a little bit of mineral spirits to make sure it was free of sawdust before putting on my Old Masters American Walnut gel stain. I really like gel stain. It's not blotchy, it goes on evenly, it's super easy to apply. Just use a foam brush it on, let it sit there for a little bit, and wipe off the excess. It is kind of a foolproof finish. I totally recommend it, especially for this project, and I was really happy with the way that they came out after a couple of coats. While that dried, I started the process of applying a varnish top coat, which I used Total Boat Halcyon Clear on the flag itself, and witness key to dye limitation number D. It's a good thing I was suspicious of this dye when I put this finish on, and I only went on the red stripe because that varnish made the dye bleed quite a bit. So this part took a little bit more time than I was initially anticipating. I had two different foam brushes, one for the white stripes, one for the red stripes, and I just took my time, stayed on the edge, and anytime anything bled over from one to the other, I had a paper towel ready. And then I had a generous glass of whiskey ready because I knew that this next part was not going to be fun. The good news is that you only have to do this once. After the initial varnish coat, it covers up all the dye and then it doesn't bleed anymore, but this was not fun. I do really like the look of the dye though. I think it is unique to what a stain or paint can do. As the varnish coats dried, I went over to Cricut Design Space and started laying out the quote. I went with the Second Amendment because I knew my father-in-law would love it, and I played around with a few layouts and fonts until I found some that I really liked and cut it out on temporary vinyl. I laid this directly on the varnish and weeded the letters off while it was on the flag. Just don't use a super sharp reading tool, you don't want to chip the wood. I used an acrylic chalk paint right over the temporary vinyl and just went back and forth using a stippling technique. You definitely want to pull that vinyl off while the chalk paint is still tacky. If you let the paint dry, it will actually come right off with the vinyl. Unfortunately, I know from experience. The good thing is it will stick to the varnish and you can varnish over it once it's fully dry. Once all my finish coats were done, it was time to glue the frame to the outer edge. Very simple process, except I totally recommend these 4-corner straps here. They're very cheap and very useful. And for extra measure, although it's probably not necessary, I went around with a brad nailer and just fastened that frame around on all 4 sides. So that's it, the flag is done, and you can be done. However, I like pain, so I decided to make this thing a little bit more unique by including this 45-degree display case shelf. I started with the same wood as the rest of the frame and cut opposing 22.5-degree angles to make a 45, and then I marked the center of those boards and transferred that mark down to the bottom edge. Now this shelf has to be kind of strong, so I held them together by first applying a little bit of CA glue to hold those weird angles in place before I can drill them. This is great stuff to keep around the shop. It comes in handy on a lot of woodworking projects. Once they cured, 20 seconds later, I moved those 2 boards over to my vise and clamped them together and pre-drilled some holes for some screws. I countersunk those screws, used a chisel to clean up the edges, and then fastened them. I notched the top of these brackets with my circular saw. I left 3/4 inches of material on the back side for where it would fasten to the frame of the flag. Using a straight edge, a palm router, and some chutzpah, I tacked the back of my finished flag with a 3/4 inch straight bit. I took about an 1/8 inch of material at each pass, checking frequently to make sure that I didn't go too deep. Once I was satisfied with the cut, I cleaned up the edges with the chisel, which turned out to be useless because I cut it too far anyway. I then countersunk some screws and fastened the brackets to the flag. Make sure to use the appropriate size screws, you really don't want to send those through the front of the flag. For the flat parts of the shelves, I used a 3/4 inch melamine. I cut them at the same 22.5-degree angle, then coated them in CA glue and used this really cool leather covering, which really helped break up all the wood that was in the frame. I gotta thank my beautiful wife for this idea. I really struggled for a while trying to think of what to do, and this ended up being the perfect solution. After a really tragic puncturing of that leather with a brad nailer, I opted for the safer method of countersinking and screwing the melamine in on all sides. I opted to use brass dowels to hold the display case in place, so after some careful measuring, I used a 3/16 inch drill bit and my drill block to get some nice straight holes for those dowels. I measured and cut the dowels on my standard miter saw. Just make sure you tape those things down so nothing goes flying into your face. Give it a little tap tap tap-a-roo. And repeat the process on the upper portion. With even more careful measuring, like seriously careful measuring, I drilled out some dowel holes in my walnut display box. And good God, would you believe it, it actually fit. I fastened the brass plaque with these really cool brass pin nails, which I just thought would look much better than screws. And I used a 1-minute epoxy on the back of the eagle to fasten that to the leather. I centered it on the display, pressed it in, let it cure, and took a step back to admire the finished product. And I am so happy with the way this thing came out. I'm really proud of the work that I did for this project, and I know that my father-in-law is really going to love it. Thanks to all 3 of you who are still watching. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment down below, and I'd appreciate any liking, sharing, subscribing, all that good stuff. You guys get out there and make something awesome.